Well, welcome back to the Kingsway Podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in. Here with Jed, and obviously, I am Trevor. It is always fun to be back on the podcast, talking, having the conversations, trying to figure out what we should be learning and listening to, and adventuring into the unknown, clarifying where we can, but doing it humbly, trying to figure it out. I know that this podcast has been encouraging for me even to just do. I know that we've had several people that I think are faithfully listening, and I appreciate you. We always love to see the likes on the videos or even comments. It makes us happy to see that people are participating and are tracking along with us and learning too. We're going to do a segment that we have done before today called Context Clues. Yeah. And if you don't know what this segment's about, it's basically we take kind of some popular verses or a couple popular verses, and we try to look to see if we actually know what the context is. And a lot of times what I think the one we did before was kind of one that Jeremiah 29:11, I think was the one we did before, which you can go back and find that podcast and look that up. And then I think it was Matthew 6:33 as well. So, you know, if you're looking for, you know, maybe today's context clues don't hit you right between the coffee cup and the shirt that you have on at the current moment, or the daily verse of whatever that you're reading, maybe go back and check that episode out. You can look it back up, Context Clues. But today's verses, Jed is scrambling right now to find one.
Scrambling is a good word.
Is it scrambling? Okay.
Yeah, a little bit. I prepare just so heavily for these things.
I figured you did. But if you prepare too much, then it's not really... There's no clues to figure out. Like, we got to have like a middle ground here. I mean, I brought my handy dandy notebook and my Bible, so I'm like as prepared as could be.
I think that means you're the true Christian, and I'm like I don't even know.
Dude, whatever. This is just the modern version. The modern version.
MacBook Christian.
You're the Chrome version.
Apple Christian.
So, all right. So, do we have a verse or a first verse?
Yeah, I think I found one I like right here.
Okay.
Start with Galatians 5:13.
Okay.
Let me just read that for you here real quick.
I'm just writing it down so my brain will remember it.
It says, "For you were called to freedom, brothers. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another."
You were called to freedom. Say that one more time.
Yes, you were called to freedom, brothers. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another.
Opportunity for the flesh. Use it to serve one another in love. Okay. Sorry, I'm just doing my chicken scratch. It helps me remember and think through some things. So, all right. So the first thing I'm going to do is just look it up. If you're watching, I think it'd be good. Just find Galatians. This is a great Bible test for me. Just kind of flip through. It's first.
See if MacBook can beat.
First Galatians 5:13. I think it's right here. Okay, so
boom.
You, my brothers and sisters. The NIV includes sisters too.
Is that the new one? Is that 2011?
It's 2011. It's woke. We're called to be free, but do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh, but rather serve one another in humble love. I always think it's crazy. I'm not sure that this is the exact direct translation, but we don't have a non-gender specific pronoun that can fit. That's why they struggle in the NIV to translate that, because we can't say that non-gender specific pronoun that the Greek can. And so I don't know if that's the exact, but I guarantee you we make it masculine because we're naturally masculine. He, they, whatever, but they can have a neutral, which we don't, which is kind of a cool little thing there, brothers and sisters. I'm not sure that's exactly that. I don't have my Greek translation, nor can I speak Greek, so I'm going to pretend. You could probably look it up.
But I've got the accordance right here.
Oh, gosh. I'm going to be made look stupid. You were called to be free. That word freedom right now, that's an interesting hot topic word, isn't it, right now? Ooh, we're made to be free. Ooh.
So we don't have to wear masks. That's what it says.
I was more thinking like the Declaration of Independence, or or like the Constitution.
I thought that got canceled.
Oh, that got canceled too. Dang Corona. But do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. That's an interesting word in English. The flesh. I never use that word in English for anything. Honey, my flesh cries out for food.
For me, it's kind of like moist.
When you say flesh, it's like a weird word.
Like
See, the only times I ever feel like flesh, it's like an injury. Like that's
Yeah.
what I feel like. Like,
Yeah.
dude, like my flesh was like laying open, and like it like gives me the heebie-jeebies even thinking about it. Like when you get a paper cut and you can spread it, and you're like, you're like ah! Like that's what it feels like to
Here's
me.
something interesting here, though.
Okay.
I just looked up this verse in accordance, which for those of you
That's a
watching,
reference.
yeah, it's just like a study tool. Yeah, it's something that we have that we use it at Ozark for a lot of interpretation classes.
Yeah.
But looking at flesh in the Greek, this word is also commonly translated to sinful nature.
And it says in mine here, it says the Greek, it's a sinful state of human beings, often presented as a power in opposition to the spirits. So like spirit, capital S.
Yeah. So it's not saying like use your freedom as an opportunity for your like
Human desires.
Yeah. That is what it's kind of getting at, not like literally your flesh.
Yeah, so like you can't eat good food, like because that's for your body, right? No, it's not. No. This is to indulge. I think is a good word. To indulge your primitive or your humanistic desires. Okay, and it says in power as a power in opposition to the Spirit, which is the Spirit is the Holy Spirit, which Matthew would tell us is the giver of all truth and the revealer of all God's truth, and is the actual conduit to which God works through us. And so like. All things that God is trying to do, reveal truth and have our lives lived in truth.
Yeah.
This flesh is in opposition to that power. Okay. So that's a good way to think about flesh. And then it says, rather serve, which I always think one another humbly in love. Humbly is added in there.
Yeah, I don't. Mine says, this is the ESV, through love, serve one another. There's no, it takes out that humility aspect. But at the same time, again, this Greek word translated to serve as a slave.
Yeah. So humbly is more of the position rather than a trait.
Yeah.
It's you're less than.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you're like placing yourself even at that position. Like
underneath.
choosing to be. Yeah.
I like that a lot. So what's the fuller context? So we're kind of getting a little bit of the thing. When I go back and I look at the header, which we've talked about headers before, top of chapter 5, the headers were added in later to kind of give a little bit of context, but not always trustworthy in the sense of the fullness of what's going taught. But it says freedom in Christ in chapter 5. So it seems like Paul, because I know Galatians, not because I've done the relation, but I've done enough background that Paul's writing this to the church in Galatia, which is a Western Greek city. Western Greek? I think it's Eastern Greek.
I don't know.
I think it's Eastern Greek city.
Okay.
Because it's on the inner loop of the Italy and all that. Anyway, I have to double check, but I'm pretty sure it's an Eastern Greek city, and it's a port city. It's very important. It has a prominence to it.
Yeah.
And so, this is obviously a church that he's in. So it says right at the beginning of chapter 5, this is 12 verses before, but I think it's a good context for us. It says, it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then. Do not let yourselves be burdened by a yoke of slavery. So I think it's curious that we just talked about how you're supposed to humble yourselves to a slave to love one another, but the yoke of slavery is not something we're supposed to be under anymore. So that doesn't give me necessarily all the clarity that I want, but I think it's funny that the key words that we were already honing in, free is already said in there, stand firm is already said in there.
Starting that whole section.
That whole section has it.
Now, I immediately have a question here is when he says, do not submit again. So I'm thinking there's something specific that the yoke of slavery is referring to something specific.
Yep. Now
I know
what that is because I've done enough research on this, which it's actually one of those topics that I think the church kind of sometimes dances around. So it's nice to be on a podcast.
Sure,
it's around following Jewish rules, versus Christian rules, and so the Galatian church, of course, has this divide where they have these Jewish roots, but then they have these new Greek Gentile Christians.
Yeah, and that's probably not even exclusive to Galatia. That's like the entirety of Christendom
it's almost all of Paul's letters have something in this.
So here specifically, if you look at the next verse, you even see that he talks specifically about circumcision, a Jewish practice.
Yes.
So
specifically, he's going to talk about circumcision as one of the dividing things, but you're going to see it in like Romans. He's going to talk about dietary things.
Yeah.
He's going to go all the way down to the food that they're eating.
Yeah.
Right. And then even Paul and Peter in Acts, they get in, like, who they're sitting with. Mm-hmm. Like, they're not even allowed to associate with, Peter's sitting with the Jewish and Paul's sitting with the Gentiles. And he's realizing that by just who they sit with and eat, not just what they're eating, not the circumcision, but like how they sit together is actually causing a little bit of this. And so it really seems to be a theme that Paul is having to create restoration in between these two groups of people. So I think what we're going to get to here is if we read these 12 verses before, what Paul is going to drive to, and I think you'd see this if you drove, is Paul is saying that under Christ, we are in a new covenant, which that circumcision is the covenant decision to follow into the Jewish line of Abraham. Mm-hmm. And so that circumcision on the 8th day, if you were born into a Jewish family, it would be kind of this site that you are being circumcised into that covenant relationship. Not only that, your parents are going to carry that out and bring you through. It's kind of the first sign of your folding into this special group, which is a crazy thing that goes back to all the way to Abraham being the first demonstration of that. You can go back and look that up if you wanted somewhere. I think it's like Genesis 20.
Yeah, Genesis somewhere.
I was trying to think. Genesis...
Probably like 16 or 17.
Yeah.
Somewhere in there.
Anyway, we could look that up. But at the same time, what's happening now, if you can imagine a older man then is converted into Christianity, and all these Jewish men have been taught from a very young age that this is the sign of the covenant, they're going like, you need to come into the sign of the covenant. Yeah. And much like you and I would be if we weren't circumcised. Let's just be real about this. Like if that's the tall sign, I think these guys better be really convinced that, I'm not sure. And I think they're really glad Paul wrote this letter because Paul basically comes back and says like, that's no longer necessary. Yeah. Mm-hmm. He's not trying to nullify it. I think that's the danger in this too, because there seems to be like the guys that got it done then are like, whoa, like was it worthless? And it's like, no, like it's no longer a part of the new relationship. It would be much like if we changed the tradition of wearing a wedding ring. Mm-hmm. All right, this is a sign of a covenant, right? In our culture, but this is not the sign of a covenant all over the world, right? And so if all of a sudden a new married couple came in and they weren't wearing wedding rings and it was a big deal to like, that's the sign of like you being married, there would be this major discussion. However, there are some people that are allergic to alloys, allergic to metals, that have lost a ring, right? And like it doesn't change the relationship anymore. Mm-hmm. It doesn't change, whether or not they're married. And so, Paul's trying to explain this, I think, in terms that for a lot of these Jewish men and the Jewish culture, it's a new concept that the covenant has changed. Now, what I think is really curious is that first verse there really is the key to unlocking this whole section. Mm-hmm. And that first verse of chapter 5, when it says, no longer let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. I love that you hit that. So basically, I know this because I've done research before, and I want people to realize, like, I'm not just like pulling this out of my back. I've looked at these verses intentionally before. That yoke of slavery is talking about the law itself. Mm-hmm. It's talking about the old covenant itself with Israel. Yeah. You remember this? I think you've learned this too. I think we've talked about this before. And so that yoke of slavery he's talking about is the law had limitations. Yeah. It could only take it so far. And really what Jesus says and what Paul would say is the law's purpose was to reveal the need for Jesus. Yeah. Not to do the work of Jesus. It works in tandem with Jesus, and Jesus is the fulfillment of the need. Yeah. But what Jesus does is release that yoke, which the yoke is the oxen pull cart thing. Mm-hmm. And I'm a city boy, so some people out there may need this, but they would actually specifically make these for each pair of ox. Mm-hmm. And so each would stand next to each other. They would make them individually. They would sit on their shoulders, and then they would lock underneath their neck, and they could pull. And basically what they're saying is, don't let this be placed on you again. The law was the thing that I released you from on the cross. Mm-hmm. Now, when I hear that, and I'm a pastor's kid, you're a little bit of a pastor's kid too, PK, you got a little PK in you. I hear, okay, I don't have to follow any rules, right? Yeah. Like the law has been taken off, the rules have been removed, I am now free. And I think Paul feels that tension. I really think Paul feels that tension, especially to those that didn't grow up under the law. So not only do they not have to do what the law says, but they don't even know it yet.
Yeah.
And he's like, oh, wait a second. Because I don't know if you've ever been in a place where you remember as a child, your parents left you alone for some of the first times.
Yeah.
Do you remember this? You have a few brothers and sisters.
A couple.
So mom and dad go out on a date.
Mm-hmm.
They put your older brother in charge, older sister in charge, and they go, hey, we'll be back in a couple hours, right? Close that door, and they walk away. It was like the Wild West within 2 minutes. And let's just be real. I mean, some of you out here know this. All of a sudden, the rule that was over top of everything, that was mom and dad, it has left the building. And now there is a new rule. No rule, right? Like there's
No parents, no rules.
no rules, right? I mean, and so I know that chaos that, followed would be attention. I remember specifically a story, and this is just fun for the podcast because I get to share these types of things. And maybe you got one too. Do you have a story for when you don't even want to share? You're so around your parents.
My mom listens to this podcast.
Yeah, my parents do too, so I'm in trouble. We had this sunken in staircase with that. So you came in our house, and then to the left was a railing, and it was a sunken staircase to go to our basement. Okay. So that railing you could jump up and like crawl over inside the house because it's a sunken staircase. And it was kind of like you could look down into the staircase immediately and you walked in. Well, it's really fun to climb up, but we weren't allowed to. But we did. And what we would do is we would get our dog to chase us. She would come down there. We'd jump on the hand railing, jump over the top, and then she would chase us back up the stairs. We'd jump over the railing, jump back down. And then we'd just do it like a game. And then we'd put a bunch of pillows at the bottom so we could, jump like we were jumping down. Well, my parents left. And I don't know how long after they left, but we broke the hand railing off the side of the sunken staircase. So this sunken staircase all of a sudden just breaks free, and it's this giant piece of drywall and the anchor, and it's just hanging off the wall. And my brother and I don't know how old we were, but I still remember my brother was like, I know where the putty is. And like we straight up puttied the wall and like tried to repaint it. And like in the amount of time that they were gone. And my dad, I don't think he found it right away. Like it was one of those like later he like put his hand on it and he realized it wasn't as strong because that's not you can't putty that big of a hole. And then on top of that, I don't think we got the paint quite right. It was like, but he was so impressed. I remember he was like, I'm somewhat impressed, but then he was also angry. Like, what have you done? Now I say all that, and I know that's silly, and maybe you don't want to share a story, but I really mean that I think Paul can feel the tension of there is going to be a major, crazy outpouring of like there are no rules, and the Jews are. I think they just think it's going to be the Wild West. I really think they're going to feel that tension. And so when I read this verse, right?
Yeah.
I hear you, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free. Mm-hmm. The desire was that rules were not supposed to be the reason that you act well, that you love well. Mm-hmm. It was supposed to be a relationship. It was supposed to be something that I treat you well and you treat me well because we love each other.
Yeah.
And we know that we care about each other. Mm-hmm. And because of that, that's a different way to live than the Jews had lived.
Yeah.
And it's a different way than the law had treated them. But there's a certain intensity of that has to be driven in. And you can feel that in the second half of the verse when he's like, serve from a lower position, do it humbly, love one another. That's the fulfillment of the new relationship.
Yeah.
That's how you live this out. And what's fun is like in one verse in chapter 5, verse 1, you feel this like, oh, don't let anybody put a yoke of slavery on you, which is a list of rules and this law. Mm-hmm. But then you read the real weight of that verse in 5:13, and you realize it's not a yoke of slavery, but it's also not easy.
Yeah.
It is something it's like the burden of a great gift, right? It's like when the parent cuts you loose and says, you can do whatever you want. I love you. And you're like, that's awesome. I really don't want to let you down. Yeah. I really want to I want to deserve, what I've received already. And I think that's a dangerous way for people to think about how the gospel's supposed to be lived out. Because I really think there's a lot of people that still think the context of this this verse is there's still a lot of rules that we have to follow in order to follow Jesus. And Paul is very, very, very directly saying, like, no, that's not how this works.
Yeah. I mean, even just reading the next verse after 13, you just nailed it. He says, for the whole law is fulfilled in one word. You shall love your neighbor as yourself.
And I think the intensity of what Paul's trying to drive home, knowing the other context of the verses, right? The fruit of the Spirit, knowing everything that he's come through in this section of this letter, that he's trying to remind them of, like, the fruits of the Spirit are different. The law, led to a labor of basically, brokenness and seeing whereas the labor of Christ now has given you this new access to the Spirit. So no longer do you get the flesh, you get the Spirit. And that's the whole law, right? Summed up. Which I hope the next time someone reads this verse, for you are free, you are set free intentionally for something.
Yeah.
And I think that's always the second half of like, you were set free to do something, not set free just for your own indulgences. You were set free intentionally for something that I have planned, and it's all for love one another. Which I feel like we just need a little bit of more like that these days. We just need a little bit of more of that. There's a lot of debate on policies and what needs to be put in place, and I love how the gospel cuts through all of that. And it basically just says, like, what if you just ask the question, what's the best way to love the person across from me, next to me, around me?
Yes.
And if we just ask that question, I think a little bit more, and stop trying to live under the law, and just lived under that rule of thumb of what we've received. I think it would cut through the restrictions sometimes that it feels, and we would also feel the burden of what we've been given. Yeah. Right? That we weren't put underneath the law, we were pulled out of that. And whether it's a political issue, a face mask issue, a racial issue, a money issue, even a theology issue, I think we have to be careful that if we raise up rules as the only way to heart transformation, I think we miss the freedom that can be found even in our own hearts to just love the person across from us, and how I think most of the time we make excuses on why we don't have to. And that really makes me sad, because I think that's what Paul is really trying to break down here, is that people don't have to be circumcised, people don't have to follow the law to be worthy of love. Dang. So, if we can get that context right, and I'm still working on it too. Maybe in the middle of this pandemic, we kind of figured that out ourselves. Yeah, that's a good one. I like that verse a lot. There's a lot of desire right now for people to be free. Yeah, I think we're free to love, man.
You're free to love. Yeah, that's good.
Free to love. Well, cool. Do you want to do one more? You want to call it there?
I think let's call it there.
Yeah. I've always enjoyed these context clues. Here's the thing about these context clues. I think if you're the listener and you're paying attention, you listen to this whole thing, I'm really proud of you. Thank you so much for tuning in. You probably have a verse that you've quoted that you think about. Maybe it's something you just heard in a passing by in a sermon. Maybe it's just something that you repeat inside your head. Maybe it's not even the full verse. It's just a portion of it. Yeah. Man, I'd love to see that verse in the comments, or to have a message from to one of us to say, hey, I'd really love for you to break this down, or to give me the deeper meaning. And don't be scared about it. Don't be scared that maybe you misinterpret, you don't know the full meaning. Don't be intimidated by that. But we would love to see that comment. I'd love to know it. Ezekiel 36:26 is the one that I always have in my heart. I hope you'll go look that up. I'm not even going to tell you what it is.
It's rude.
it's a beautiful, beautiful section of scripture of imagery in Ezekiel. But that verse, when I looked up the meaning after I read kind of the intensity of it, it was even more powerful, knowing kind of the picture behind it. So I want to see some comments of that. I'd love to see some comments on that. So
that'd be awesome.
Thanks so much for tuning in today, Jed. That was a good verse. And I hope that you're having a blessed week. Remember, talk less, pray more. just listen and learn a lot right now. And you are always, no matter what's going on in your life, free to love. You're always free to love the person across from you. That's what Jesus paid for. So do it well. You guys have a great and glorious day in the Lord. We'll see you later.